So one of the big topics of the Timcast REO, the second date that I was there, and one of the big topics was the concept of monopolization and or the fear rather of monopolization when we talk about and discuss decentralization. Great conversation to be had, necessary conversation to be had. And there was an instance where Ian brought up an instance where roads, like let's say I live on said property and there were roads that were around me. And I think the first instance, and it kind of changed at one point, but I think Tim brought that up. Tim was like, okay, it may take you, I could be wrong. If you go this way, it takes you 1 hour. And but if this guy doesn't know what you're on the road and you have to go do another route and it takes you 10 hours. But a lot of it more so was, and I think it started at an instance where, okay, this person owns the roads that are around my property, all of them. And because he doesn't like my wife or something, he then decides that I can't travel on them. Now, that, of course, turned into, and what I had mentioned was that is nearly an impossible, or more so an unlikely scenario, a very unlikely scenario. And this is why I was saying that we have to discuss how we got there. And it's the easiest to be a critic of, let's say, libertarianism and start from the most preposterous hypothetical that you can extend it to, and then expect it, or more so demand an answer. And that's an easy thing to do because you're not required to talk about how we got there. And you understand how many things have to go right, or rather how many things have to go wrong for a person not to be to live in an area in which someone owns all the roads, has enough power in said ownership, or more so in efficiency and enforcement, that he can prevent me from driving on said. Just that alone, it's a very unlikely scenario. But the conversation, more so, or rather the example that he had used was, let's say it's an historical instance where we talked about in New York. And there was a part where because he had said, well, this guy owned all of these roads and blah, 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 railroads in New York. And I said, it was more so it monopolized them. That was more so what we were looking at. And I said, I have a very hard time to believe. I'm going to need to see the receipts on that. And Ian didn't know, which that's not a knock to him. He was using that as an example, and he didn't necessarily know how it got there. Aside from one of the guys that we're going to discuss here in a little bit came from another industry and was able to own a decent portion of the railroads. And he used that as an instance of a historical instance in which, okay, that can happen when someone monopolizes the roads. So before we talk about that, let's discuss what a monopoly is. I think that's the most important conversation to have. Because monopoly is a term that's used rather loosely, and I think too loosely. A monopoly does not, certainly in how I would define it, it does not mean that you are the only person that, let's say, produces a product in a particular area, or not produces, let's say produces something, whether it be in a commodity, a good, or a service. Because at that point, anything could be a monopoly, right? If there is one, I don't know, taco store in my city, in my small town or something like that, you wouldn't say that person owns has a monopoly on tacos, right? If you said that would be kind of, I think it'd be insane. This is why effectively the most realistic, let's say that, definition of a monopoly is when someone has exclusive legal control over the production of something, right? So no matter what it is that it is, they have exclusive legal control. And that means that it would be illegal for someone to produce that particular thing, a commodity or an entire good. And I think that it needs to expand over a large geographical area, right, in order for that to be considered a monopoly. And that's what historically, for the most part, is what it is and what it has been. So the example that was discussed, though, on the show was railroads. And so I did my research because that's what I said I was going to do. I was like, I don't think it happened in the way that it's being described. And it didn't. I went and looked it up. So the instance that we were talking about is Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt was a guy that, hilariously enough, worked in the steamboat, which I knew who Vanderbilt was, but what he was referring to, that instance in New York, I didn't know what he was talking about. And I said that. I was like, I have a hard time believing that's how it went down. So Vanderbilt came from more so the like steamboat industry. And hilariously enough, in his come up, let's say there, he actually dealt with an instance where you can make the argument that there was a monopoly in a large geographical area when he was working with Gibbons. And there was a actual case, you can look it up, called Gibbons v. Ogden, that you can look up, that dealt with this sort of monopoly. And that was in a different industry, though. It wasn't necessarily in the railroad. What he did do, and what was true, and what he alluded to, which was correct, in that he got his like money per se being in another industry, in the steamboat shipping industry and all of that. And then that money led to what you're leading into like the mid like 1850s, 60s, going in 1870, which then he invested more so in the railroad industry. And in that, this was actually after he had kind of became the bigger part of it. There was a consolidation of, let's say, I don't want to say wealth, more so of the railroads, right? Where you had these smaller companies and they would either fail or get bought out or something like that. And then that turned into what you guys know as more so the New York Central and Hudson. However, they never had there was no real instance where Vanderbilt had to deal with fighting these claims of monopoly, because he didn't have a monopoly on that. He didn't have a monopoly on railroad. Not even in New York did he have a monopoly on railroad. Did he own a lot, or rather did New York Central deal with what they consider like a big major business because of how many of the railroads that they controlled? Absolutely. Absolutely. But that's not what a monopoly is. This is what I talk about when we talked about, like, for example, when Tim said, which I felt was wrongful, and I told him this. He says Twitter has a monopoly like on political like conversation or something. I said, Tim, no, they don't. We're talking about politics on YouTube right now. Google doesn't own Twitter, right? So that was a mere example, and why I say you have to be careful, and why we need to be careful when we just throw this term monopoly. Monopoly does not mean big, successful business. So the correct thing is that, yes, New York Central Railroad owned a lot of the railroad and a lot of the transportation in that regards, but they didn't have a monopoly on it. In fact, after he had passed, going into the, like, you know, obviously the railroad industry starts to kind of change post World War II. So you're going into the 1900s. They merged with their competitor, and which essentially beat them out. And that was what the Pennsylvania Railroad, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it was the Pennsylvania Railroad, which, much like New York Central, ran in other spots. So don't let the name confuse you. And they were, for the better part of going into the latter 1800s, even after Vanderbilt had passed, they were competing with each other. Right? So they didn't. And that's why when it came to the railroad spot, nobody ever really considered Vanderbilt, maybe some leftists, maybe today looking at it in retrospect, Vanderbilt or New York Central having a monopoly on railroads, because they didn't. Did they own a lot of the ones definitely in New York? Yes. But that's not what a monopoly does not mean. Okay, you have, you're very successful and a lot of people utilize your service. That's not what a monopoly is. That's not what a monopoly is. And that's what I wanted to go look up, and I wanted to look at the receipts on that. But seriously, though, let's look at that scenario and applying it to, let's say, more of a modern scenario. Let's talk about what railroads are. And going back to that example, railroads were obviously this sort of big time form of not only transportation, but shipping, and all of that. And not even mention this James J. Hill, and him being a big competitor in the railroad industry, though albeit kind of coming from the west, the northwest, instead of the east, much like Pennsylvania Railroad, I believe that was what it was, and New York Central. So there were competitors in the railroad industry, and obviously they clashed with each other, worked with each other. They was actually incentivized in a lot of cases to be cooperative with each other. But that was the main form of transport, and then they got almost completely phased out, but they got phased out. Yes, there's still railroads that exist, but most people don't. Once people had access to trucks and cars more often, and you had the actual roads being built, interstate travel and all of that, they kind of get phased out, and people have less of a need for that, right? And that's in one way in how kind of more so innovation changes that, and technology and technology advancement kind of almost regulates the market, right? Because you have this problem where people then come up with solutions. So while I might think it's preposterous to say, okay, well, what if X and O man owns this, hates your wife, and doesn't want you on the roads? I could also say, well, what if I and me and McJetpacks have successfully been able to build jetpacks, and then I fly over your bitch ass roads. Now what? Right? And it sounds crazy to say that, but that's a thing that could happen. Who's to say that we'll even need them? Who's to say that where we're going we'll even need roads going into a future in a free society? Definitely when you consider our patent laws and all this sort, and how the state being involved in the oil industry doesn't really even incentivize people to come up with, let's say, flying ways of transportation. So seriously, technology, people acting within a marketplace, competing with each other, cooperating with each other is a big time necessary thing. And this is why I'm an advocate of decentralization, because I want the power to get closer and closer and closer to the individual. And when we talk about monopolies and the fear, it didn't happen with, we've already went through the fact that New York Central didn't have a monopoly on railroads, but also in the instances where you can make a case that there was an argument to be made about monopolies actually existing in an area, or like over a big geographical area. The closest thing would be the bail monopoly. And if you go watch my previous videos, I'm not going to bore you guys to death with this, but if you go watch my previous videos on net neutrality and talking about the bail monopoly, much like how Vanderbilt was dealing with fighting government subsidized quasi monopolies, not actual monopolies, but kind of these quasi monopolies, sort of setups where they were actually working with legislators to monopolize areas, and more so what they serviced, and more so the goods that they provided. The same can be said here. Right, much like that. That was an actual thing. That was a steamboat. That wasn't the railroads, though. That was steamboat Vanderbilt that I'm referencing. Right, the bail monopoly was the same thing, and I documented this. These aren't these sort of natural occurring phenomena where someone is not only able to be the only sole producer, but they make it illegal for a competitor to exist. They would need a state in order to make that happen. So the fear, which is hilarious, that a monopoly would exist, or monopolies would exist in the event that the state didn't get in the way, show me the receipts in where that was a thing that happened. Because almost nowhere was that a case when you talk about historical precedent. The monopolies or near monopolies that have existed have almost exclusively utilized the state to become that. Be it in, okay, hey, in this area, I work with the local government, state government to be the only provider. I get government contracts. I get government subsidies to be able to provide that. Whatever it is, they need it, and it requires a state. So I don't want, and this is why I have made the argument, you've heard other people make this argument as well, in which that every argument that you make against decentralization, or more so a freer society, you would have to then apply that to your desire to have a government. And that was the point that I made on the show on Timcast. It's like, so I'm expected to come up with this instance where, this scenario that you didn't even describe how, it's a hypothetical, pure hypothetical, and you didn't even describe how we got there. It's just, okay, here's the end game. Guy owns all roads around you. This is what he does. How do you respond? Right? Don't tell me how such a preposterous scenario came about. Don't even say how that happened. Just, okay, it happened. You're expecting me or anybody else, to let's say the libertarian, to come up with this pretty little in a bowl answer to that. Okay, bet. Nonetheless, if you fear an individual being that powerful, it would make more sense for you to not want to give them a territorial monopoly on use of force, violence, and ultimate decision making to make their ideals come about. And this is why I had mentioned, when you talk about actual democide, not even including war, the governments around the world are responsible for killing in the last century, 250 million of their own people. There is not any private equivalent to what Mao Zedong did, or what Pol Pot did, or what Hitler or Stalin, USSR, even Lenin, Zimbabwe, Somalia, failed socialist. There is no private equivalent to that large of a scale, impacting that large of a person. Now, that doesn't mean that libertarianism is perfect. And this is why I particularly took issue when he said that was, I felt that that's why I called him disingenuous. I still think that argument was disingenuous that Tim made, which it is what it is. That happens in conversation. When he says that, okay, I'm advocating utopianism. I'm like, no, it's the opposite. Right? I've never once claimed that libertarianism meant a perfect society. Never. There will be people that are done that have wrongdoings, let's say, done to them. People will have be aggressed upon. The idea is that I want to limit that, and I don't want to give power for individuals to enact that said aggression to the largest scale. I want to minimize that, and I want competing agencies and cooperative firms, competing and cooperative firms, to come up with solutions to these problems. And this is why in this segment on this note, and this, I'm an advocate of decentralization because I don't have all the answers. I don't. And for anybody and for everybody who would ever dare suggest that a libertarian can't answer, or you're having your feet held to the fire and you can't come up with an answer, why would you expect that from me anyway? Do you not understand? Clearly you don't. Why it is that I'm an advocate of decentralization? It's because I am smart enough to understand that I don't have all the answers. So if you think that 4 individuals within the room can make a decision on behalf of millions of people, or how a particular marketplace or area would deal with a particular scenario, you're insane. And and it makes sense as to why you advocate authoritarianism, because the state just put everybody under the illusion that they're doing something. Obviously, they're doing something well. Like in this case, it was travel. The state ensures that people, which they don't, by the way. But the idea that the state ensures that people can freely travel within the state, as if like warrants and suspended licensing and all of that sort of stuff doesn't exist. So they do that. But this is the general idea that they wouldn't be that petty to stop someone or what have you. So let me get this straight. We're worried about an individual doing that, right? Let's say being petty against someone else's wife, not liking their wife, and they decided they want to stop whatever for one individual. The state can do that and has done that at a much larger scale. Not to mention, because they monopolize, you guys drive. I can't understand how anybody riding down in Dallas, Texas, or riding up and down Texas on I-35 can sit up here and think that it's still a good idea as they do construction, but long drawn out this construction, because they've monopolized essentially the roads you have to go. I don't know how anybody can drive on that shit I-35 and sit up here and still make an argument for monopolized roads by way of the state. Unbelievable. But the idea is that we want to limit that. It's not to eliminate it. Doesn't pretend that we can eliminate it. But we believe freer people acting within a marketplace is are going to be the best suited. So all I can do is theorize. All Walter Block, he does this great long write-up about these sort of ideas and how it could be done. That's just what that is. And nobody applies that. They expect a libertarian, and maybe even non-libertarian, let's say guys that advocate for smaller government or government being out of the way. Because the government has monopolized things for so long, they can't envision a world in which they don't. This is why I use the shoe example, right? If the state monopolized shoes and they handed them out, they decided if you were going to be a vendor, how much you had to, what kind of shoe you could sell. Much like, the not quasi, it was actually socialistic by the German model of like kind of what Nazi Germany did, where, if you wanted, you had to sell it at this price, you had to make it like this, all of that sort of stuff that exists. And even some instances with the USSR where they completely control like food and stuff, right? And so they dictated who could get it, at what time they had to get it, how much it had to be sold by, if at all, and that's obviously how they ended up with shortages, overages, more so into the USSR. But my thing is, I want that decentralized, because I don't want to not only give those guys all of that power to be able to enact whatever crazy ideal it is that they want. It's that I understand that, much like if shoes, the state monopolized that. All it takes is a generation, and then you just completely don't understand how that would be done. And this is why moving towards a more centralized society is worse, because it makes obviously the problem worse. Because again, if the state monopolized deodorant, I know Bernie Sanders is going to be triggered by this. We don't need all of these different deodorants. Anyway, but if the state monopolized deodorant, all it would take is one generation for the state and then everybody would be like, who will build the deodorant? That's all it takes, because you're not used to it. So what they expect you to come up with, because the state has made it pretty for them, because they just forced out all their competition, or if you are going to be a private provider of deodorant, you'd have to go through them, much like kind of roads in this country. Right now, the private roads where you still have to kind of go through the state. The problem with that is moving towards centralization is that from a cultural standpoint, all it takes is one generation, and then they don't understand it. But I don't want to put it in a pretty little inefficient bowl that piles up trillions of dollars worth of, we're getting closer to 30 trillion, right? Worth of debt, right? That's the best that we could come up with, right? And it's working, by the way, guys. It's not like we're going into January and everybody's at each other's necks. This system works. You got almost $30 trillion worth of debt. It works. How can we be moved to a libertarian society? It works. Yeah, it's working. It's not working, by the way. I was being completely sarcastic. It doesn't work. It's not working. But and that's not even talking about unfunded liabilities, chat. It doesn't work, but I'm not trying to put it in a pretty little bowl, because I can't. I do not possess the capacity to be able to do that. You would not ask me that with bottled water. You would not ask me that. I don't know how to make video games like controllers or anything. That's not my expertise. I own all of this stuff. This camera right here, this software that I'm using. I didn't create any of that. I have it, but I didn't create any of that. And all it is the market decided that there was something that they wanted. There was a solution that they wanted to provide, and they provided a solution, and I reaped the benefit, and it lifts my living standard. Beautiful thing. So even if I do theorize, that's all it is. It could happen in a completely different way. So this is why it's complete nonsense for someone to demand an answer where they want you. They say, hey, you, this is the preposterous scenario that I'm going to come up with. What if you're staying next to your neighbor and he sneezes and his snot lands on a mine and blows up the entire neighborhood? How would you respond? Like, that's the type of crazy shit that we deal with, right? They come up with the most extreme possible example, and then they want you to come up with a solution to that exact example. Now, granted, they didn't have to come up with a precise way in terms of how that came about, right? What was the scenario, more so the rules that were set that, okay, if this problem did occur, how do we deal with it? They don't even have to answer that. They just come up with the most preposterous answer that they can find, and then they expect and demand that you come up with a solution to that. And if you can't, or rather you say, well, that's not, this is just a theory. Oh, gotcha, libertarian. See, this is why it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You didn't come up with an answer to this precise scenario that I'm asking you on the spot. You crackhead. That's the reason why we advocate for decentralization. That's the reason why we advocate for a freer society, because we know that we don't have all of the answers. And there's no way me as an individual that you're asking for an authoritarian, centralized answer to a freer market. It's like you don't even understand why it is that we advocate what it is that we advocate. Decentralization is the answer. Monopolies, they need that necessitates more so the state. And it is what it is.